Hi BookTube, and welcome to a new video, which is my wrap-up of Non-Fiction November, in which I read I've read 3.5 titles against the 4 prompts. So the first one is Kim Gordon, Girl in a Band. The prompt for this was Buzz, as Kim Gordon was the singer and bassist in Sonic Youth, a New York noise band who existed for 30 years. I felt music, buzz and all of that satisfied the prompt for this. Now, for me, I'm a big into my music. British music sort of died in the early 1980s when what was left of post-punk and new wave unfortunately fell away as bands broke up, band members died, and under the austerity of the Thatcher Conservative government, we had this escapist music called New Romanticism, with lots of makeup, hairspray and synthesizer music. And I don't think we've ever rediscovered our music mojo. Now, people can come back to me on that and say I'm wrong, but this is how I feel. But in the late 80s, there were some interesting musical stirrings from New York City, a city which itself was very much, you know, a forge for artists to create, because in the late 70s there were lots of burnt out tenements because landlords couldn't make any money from the rents because no one wanted to live there, so they just burnt their properties for the insurance money. There was the crack heroin and then crack epidemics, of course, and New York was a mess, but it did provide low cost housing for people to live in, particularly in Soho and Greenwich Village. And you had what was called the no wave scene, and right at the end of that came this band Sonic Youth. So they did live in the grotty, squalid conditions of New York, but they took their music in a different way from the no wave scene, and they were certainly in the 80s and 90s one of my favourite groups until they rather sold their souls, I felt, for signing with a major label, which is David Geffen's label. So that's the background and why I was really interested in reading this. And if, as I did, you pick up this book expecting to find out about Sonic Youth, you're going to be sorely disappointed. It's a book that falls into 2 parts. The first part is Kim Gordon talking about her upbringing in Los Angeles, and the fact that she lived with a schizophrenic brother who tended to get all the attention and all the concern of the parents, which is understandable, and her role in that family dynamic being very overlooked and yet being very sensitive to being able to pick up things in her brother, and how that sort of formed her attitude to art, because on the one hand she wanted to come into the spotlight, she wanted attention on her, which she wasn't getting at home. But on the other, equally, she liked to efface and erase herself, which is what she did in the family dynamic. And those two things are quite contradictory. So at one point she says when she's on stage, she can unleash all the energy and positivity and creativity of dancing, or at least moving. And yet she also feels she wishes to be not seen, the 3 boys in the band are the ones who are the focus, and she almost disappears, which she likes. So again, it's very hard to reconcile those two impulses. So we get a lot about her growing up and stuff, and when she moves to New York, but we don't get much of a picture. She tells us New York's run down, but she doesn't go into it in any detail. I mean, I've read other books that deal with that far better. And she meets Thurston Moore, who she will marry, but she and he and Lee Ronaldo will form Sonic Youth together, the 3 of them. And she's quite generous to Thurston Moore's creative contribution to the band, given that the second half of the book is shadowed by the fact that after 30 years together in the band and in their marriage and with a daughter between them, Thurston Moore does the dirty on her and is having an affair. And the second half of the book is the stuff about Sonic Youth, where each chapter takes the name of a song from an album, and they did a lot of albums, so she's really only reviewing each album through the lens of 1 or 2 songs, the one in the name title of the chapter and then she might mention one or others. And I have to say that, you know, she talks about songs that she writes, and while you can see where they've come from in her life, they seem very, very hard to make the leap from her personal experience to what she ends up writing about. You know, she's a really fragmentary, abrupt writer of lyrics. So those chapters don't really work because they didn't really provide the information where you can say, yes, while I know that she's referring to that she's talked about in her life, this song doesn't really bring that out, as she seems to, you know, it's so subjective, it's so personal to her experience that us, the reader, can't feel that. And I think all you need to know about this book is that it is 40 pages from the end when she first talks about her relationship with the other two guys in the band who aren't her husband. You know, a band that was together for 30 years, and we have to wait till 40 pages to the end when she gives a very workmanlike interpretation of her relationship with them. And the problem is, I think one defence I'd make of this book is it is such an unusual thing to have a woman so central in a band that it's really important to have this viewpoint represented in a book, which she does. But I think my problem as a bloke is I want to know about the strange tunings, the unique tunings that Sonic Youth did in their guitars. I want to know how they discovered and quite how it changed things, and they put drumsticks and power drills between the strings on the fretboard. That's the bloke in me. But she's not writing about that because she's writing about being a woman in a band and different things. And yeah, so never the twain shall meet, unfortunately. I really didn't enjoy this very much. And in a way, the best bit about the second half of the book is when she does talk about her breakup with Thurston Moore, because it's about the only time she really exposes herself and her emotions. So, as I say, if you want to read this, imagining you'll find out about Sonic Youth, you won't. And for that reason, I'm afraid I'll give it 2.5 stars. And on to the great success of Non-Fiction November for me. 100 Artists Manifestos from the Futurists to the Stuckists, selected by Alex Danchev, who unfortunately died quite recently. And I just found this so inspiring because it's 100 manifestos. They're call to arms, they're passions stirred, they're attacks on, they're iconoclastic attacks on the status quo or what has passed before. But it's more than that. It's, through this, there are so many artistic debates which, are brought through the dialogue of one manifesto, consciously or not even consciously talking to another manifesto. And I just found it so inspiring about the whole nature of creativity and the questions you have to ask about, through that process. So it starts in 1909 with the first Futurist manifesto by Marinetti. And there's this amazing 15-year period of such fertility of futurism, Dadaism, Russian suprematism, constructivism, and 15 years later you get the first Surrealist manifesto. So this is a huge concentration of creativity as post First World War, when the world has been shattered by that war in terms of the modern age. Art is up for grabs, perception is up for grabs, reality is up for grabs, and you get all these different takes on it and all these different approaches from these art movements. And it's not just in visual art. We also have Vertov's cinema verite style of Soviet filmmaking. You have Le Corbusier. You have other architects. You have other filmmakers. Because this goes up to the 80s and 90s. So you'll get the Dogme 99 of Lars von Trier. You'll get Derek Jarman's manifesto, which he wrote as a callow 20-year-old at art school. So some very contemporary or reasonably contemporary ones as well. And another strength of it was just the sort of the history. You see movements being born and then dying. It's like following the progress of a star being born and then its light going out at its death. So it starts with Marinetti and the Futurists, where it's an attack on traditionalism, academic art, classical art. It's sort of saying all art is up till now has been influenced by the ancient Greeks and the Romans in their approach to art, and that is how all artists are taught. And it's even though you had things like Cubism and Impressionism which broke away from that, it's still a sort of smothering, suffocating hand of this sort of classicism. And futurists look to speed, they look to dynamism, they look to energy, and they look to technology as what they felt was the focus should be art. It's very material art, you know. They look to the future, and they felt this should be the subject of art rather than anything to do with classicism. Unfortunately, it was also tied into Italian nationalism, which became fascism. But anyway, but that is manifesto number one, and there are lots of other futurist manifestos, and a lot of things like Dadaism were really answers to that. And you know, one of the problems of Italian futurism is even sort of implied by the second guy to issue a futurist manifesto, who was called Umberto Boccioni, because he says we are the first futurists, and there are others will come after us who will surpass us, and he sort of says we are the primitive futurists, and he's talking specifically about their place as originators in the movement. But he's also writing that the technology that they're talking about in 1915 is primitive: cars, aeroplanes. You know, it's the start of transport, and as you know, their minds would be blown now by, you know, space travel, the speed of cars, the digital age where things don't even have a sort of tangible existence, all this sort of stuff. That they really, one of their shortcomings is they didn't realise that they were primitives within their own movement. And another one, which is pointed out by the Russian suprematists, who were equally about objects in the modern world being the focus of art, but they rejected the Italian futurist sort of specificities on speed and motion, because they're saying, because it's a fixed canvas, paint on canvas, you're only giving the impression of motion. You do, you know, swirls and walls and things like this to suggest motion, but you're not demonstrating motion. No, it's got to be purer than that. So this is what I mean as these sort of constant dialoguing on the material world in art versus the spiritual world in art. Because one of my favourite manifestos is by an abstract expressionist called Barnett Newman, an American. And he points out that the optimism about the future, as demonstrated by the futurists, is no less sentimental and nostalgic in its own way than always hankering back to the past in art. And I think he's absolutely right. And then my other sort of favourite manifesto in here is Marinetti, in that opening manifesto, expressly talks about a scorn for women, that women sort of drag down male energy. And he's rebutted in a manifesto called a manifesto for futurist women by somebody called Valentine Saint-Point. But it's not a feminist manifesto. You know, she is exerting a valuable role of women, or the female spirit, to match the male spirit in a sort of balanced world. So it's utterly not feminist. But it is so, you know, I was entranced by it. I didn't agree with it, because it is quite anti-feminist, but it's such a vigorous statement of the position of women being, you know, not deserving to be scorned, as in Marinetti. It was a fabulous read. And then finally, just going back to Barnett Newman, again, you know, if you've taken the figurative out of art, which he as an abstract expressionist was one of, you know, how do you attain the sublime in art? How do you put the sublime back into art? How do you have exaltation of art? And his manifesto is very much a sort of a plea for that. I think I mentioned that Barnett Newman was the one who sort of said that having optimism in the future is no less nostalgic and sentimental. That was Wyndham Lewis, who is a very interesting British avant-gardist, and he started up the Vorticist movement. I'd quite like to read more about him. And then finally, just to say, when I hauled this book, I said I wouldn't bother reading about the Stuckists because I have no respect for them whatsoever. But I did actually read it. But it backed up exactly what I thought. So the Stuckists, one of the Stuckist founders was a guy called Billy Childish, who was a musician and artist from the English county of Kent, which is where Tracey Emin was, you know, the famous artist, was born. and lived and grew up, and they had a relationship which broke up. And I suspect that Billie Childish's name appears on her tent, that artwork of hers where she names all her lovers by painting their names on the inside of a tent. And it seems to me that the whole of Stuckism came out of that relationship breaking up, because Stuckism attacks conceptual art, saying the only true art is painting, which is just nonsense and seems very Yabu sucks and as I say, I think it seems to me that Childish hasn't got over his breakup with Emin, and the fact that she's gone on to be a sort of world superstar artist, and he's still playing pub toilets with his rubbish band, and even that is derivative. But so, of course not every manifesto in here is great or makes sense. It's interesting that the ones involving Marxists or socialists, including there's one that Trotsky and Breton put together towards a revolutionary art, they're the most tedious, actually. They don't read well at all. And I'm not a fan of surrealism. I've talked before about how I see the role of dreams. And there's 3 or 4 surrealist manifestos in here, and I don't really... they seem to be the least manifesto-like of manifestos. They didn't seem to advance what surrealism was at all, which I found odd. But that it speaks to another point in itself, of that it's all very well having manifestos declaring in words your purpose, but when you're talking about visual and plastic arts, they don't lend themselves to words. They lend themselves to the materials of those arts. So a lot of the times a manifesto for an art movement rings quite hollow. And you go back to the first Futurist manifesto, and as I say, it is criticised that they can only produce a representation, an impression of movement. They can't produce movement on the canvas. So again, that seems to be what I was saying, that it doesn't matter what you say in words, you've got to deliver in your art, and so often they don't. Brilliant. I was so stimulated by this. I was really sorry when I finished it. And I ought to say that every manifesto is preceded by a brief biography of the writers of the manifesto and the context in which that manifesto came. And Danchev does a really good job with those, because they're really brief, they don't drag on, and sometimes they are very beautifully phrased. There's some damning with faint praise going on in here. So terrific, 5 stars. And on to Friedrich Nietzsche. I ought to say, that was for the prompt movement. Friedrich Nietzsche, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which was for the prompt discovery. I had read one Nietzsche book when in my 20s. I think it was The Twilight of the Idols and The Hammer of the Gods. And can't remember much about it. I seem to remember it was very dense and it was a tough read. So I am discovering Nietzsche, or I thought I was discovering Nietzsche when I picked this up. And the first thing to say, it's a very surprisingly easy read. Although Nietzsche is talking about philosophy, this does have the form of a novel, or even sort of parables and aphorisms, a bit like the Bible. So I raced through this, and the writing of it is fabulous. The style, the metaphors involved, the wordplay involved, just made it an absolute pleasure to read. But I have no idea really about the philosophy. I think the problem for me is there's so many aphorisms and parables that it's hard for me to hold in place an overall sort of framework of how all these bits fit together. So I'm going to tell you what I got out of it. I have no idea whether this is correct or not, my interpretation. So when you've killed God, which Nietzsche had expressed in earlier work, what fills the vacuum? Well, for Nietzsche it has to be man, but not man as we are in his sort of turn of the 20th century was currently constituted, was sort of humbled by a morality that sort of brought him to his knees, of submission, submissiveness, of false pity and false hypocritical compassion. All these things Nietzsche had no truck with. He talked in terms of the Superman. But it's not clear what constitutes such a Superman, other than it's not everyone can be a Superman. And to Nietzsche's mind, he refers to the mob, the superfluous, the rabble. So clearly it's not a thing based on that the word Superman implies that there isn't an equality about it. So, you know, it's far from being something open to everybody. It is someone who rises above that. But other than the Superman being open to anything, being willing to experiment, being a force of creativity and procreativity, and having something to do with dance and Dionysius and laughter, it's not clear what the Superman is. Clearly, Nietzsche, as Zarathustra, sees himself as a proto-Superman. He's very full of himself. As I say, the way he dismisses the rabble. And that's it, really, as far as I can see for the philosophy. There were certain specific things. There's something called he doesn't believe in eternity, in immortality for the Superman, but he doesn't believe in the eternal recurrence, that you die and then you come back and you're still a Superman, or you forge yourself to be a Superman again. So there was that. He is very funny, very withering in his attacks on things of his modern world that he sees as weaknesses. That's it, really. I can't say much more than that, other than I'm going to read an example of his prose, because it was wonderful. First I saw the sufferer suffer, and because I saw it, I was ashamed on account of his shame, and when I helped him, then I sorely injured his pride. Great obligations do not make a man grateful, they make him resentful, and if a small kindness is not forgotten, it becomes a gnawing worm. Be reserved in accepting. Honour a man by accepting from him. Thus I advise those who have nothing to give. I, however, am a giver. I give gladly as a friend to friends, but strangers and the poor may pluck the fruit from my tree for themselves. It causes less shame that way. Beggars, however, should be entirely abolished. Truly it is annoying to give to them and annoying not to give to them. And likewise sinners and bad consciences, believe me, my friends, stings of conscience teach one to sting. So you can see there's a lot of different aphorisms there, and sometimes he'll talk about the warrior spirit, and war always being a great thing for man, and the times of peace between them are just marking time. And other times he talks about the love that he gives, and it's really, that's why I say it's really confusing to bring all these together into a single unified whole. It's very much a mosaic. You say I, and you are proud of this word, but greater than this, although you will not believe in it, is your body and its great intelligence, which does not say I, but performs I. I love that. Again, this sort of mind-body duality. Your great intelligence, which does not say, your body, which does not say I, but it performs I. So, quite wonderful. And, it was almost funny in places, which I wasn't expecting in this. So he's very much veering to, it starts off as he goes up a mountain into a cave for solitude. And then as he starts sort of, preaching, he gets disciples and they, follow them around. But he sort of thins them out because he doesn't want hangers-on and people who are only there because they partially get what he says. And then in part 4, the final part, he hears this cry out in the woods. So he leaves his cave because he thinks it's the cry of the Superman. And he wants to go and meet this Superman. And he keeps running into these individuals who are all sort of disciples who've come looking for him. And they keep him from his meeting with Destiny with the Superman. It's really, really funny. And he sends them up to his cave. So go up to a cave and we'll talk then. I just need to finish this. And when he comes back from the cave, not having found the Superman, he has what's called titled The Last Supper with all these guys, which is a final test of his belief and stuff. It's just surprisingly funny. You feel his frustration as he's trying to find the source of this cry, the Superman finally meet him in the flesh. And he keeps meeting all these lesser people who sort of getting his, he can't sort of ignore them or walk around them. He has to engage with them. So surprisingly good, 4 stars. And then the book I haven't finished, this is Nothing by Blake Butler, which meets the prompt of time because it's about insomnia. And the problem I'm finding in this is that I'm going through a particularly bad jag of insomnia in October and November, which I don't really understand why now, why not the start of the epidemic, the pandemic. Because I've always found that when I'm not working, such as at weekends, going to work, commuting, in that sort of routine with certain things happening at certain times, such as the time of my commute to work and stuff. When I'm not doing that weekends, my sleep goes to pot completely. And with lockdown in March, I thought that would happen, and it didn't particularly. But now all of a sudden in October and November, it's been night after night after night. Maybe it's the sort of, the long-term cycle of not being in the same routines has finally landed on me in October and November. And I've had absolutely terrible sleep. I've had naps virtually every day, which I hate because it means it makes it harder for me to fall asleep at night. So I've been going through a really bad period of sleep, which makes it hard to pick up a book to read about what you've just endured through a sleepless night. I've read 139 pages of 330. I will finish it before the end of the year. Obviously, I haven't finished it in the month of November, but I'm finding it a struggle. The other thing about it is when it sort of is quite factual, reporting studies or giving statistics or giving certain symptoms, such as having to have your body in exactly the same place in the bed every night, a certain way, and what happens if your feet poke out of the duvet and things like that, then I can absolutely chime with what he's saying. But there are also, because he is living in his family home, a lot of his fantasias at night, lying there unable to sleep, are very much taken from his childhood. So there's a nameless man in a white car just outside his bedroom window who's always been there since childhood. There's a massive boulder behind his pillow where he sleeps. There's always, is that going to roll and crush him? And these are so subjective and personal to Butler. They don't resonate at all with me. I don't have visual manias. I used to as a child, but I don't as an adult. And also it occurs to me that if that's part of the problem keeping him awake at night, he should do a house swap for 1 year. He doesn't want to give up the family house, fine, don't sell it, but do a house swap for a year with somebody else and see if that cures those elements of his insomnia. It strikes me as blindingly obvious. I don't know, maybe that's covered in the parts of the book I haven't read, but it's a struggle, and that's not a reflection on Butler, although it's not as perfect a book as I had hoped it would be on Insomnia. So there you have it, that was my non-fiction November. For Buzz, we had Kim Gordon, Girl in a Band, 2.5 stars. For Movement, we had 100 Artists Manifestos by Alex Danchev, 5 stars. For Discovery, I certainly did discover Nietzsche. I ought to say that this was translated by R.J. Hollingdale, who does a very good job with the notes at the back and the sort of the puns that Nietzsche uses. And I gave this 4 stars. I do feel, in a way, to place it in context, I probably need to read all of Nietzsche's previous works, which I'm not sure I have the stomach or the compunction to do. Because let's face it, the talk about the Superman, it's, Nietzsche probably didn't mean it in terms of the Nazis, but you can see how easy it was for the Nazis to take that seed and come up with their vile ideology and see themselves and make themselves as the Superman. So I'm not sure I am going to read all of Nietzsche, but I think I would have got more context for this, how it develops on his previous works. And finally, unfinished as yet, nothing Blake Butler, so I'm not going to grade this until I finished it. So there you have it, a mixed non-fiction November, I feel. That was a delight, an unexpected delight, but I don't think it's going to lead me anywhere. This was pure pleasure, and this was just really disappointing. So till next November, I guess, on this one at least. Thanks very much.